to the Shop, episode 198, The Evolution of the Coffee House, with Professor Jonathan Morris. Well, hey everybody, and welcome to another episode of Keys to the Shop, where we give you insights, inspiration, and the tools you need to grow as a coffee service professional. My name is Chris DiFirio. I'm your host for the show. Thank you so much for joining me today. Really excited to talk about cafe history with Professor Jonathan Morris, a coffee historian, author of the book Coffee, A Global History. You're not going to want to miss this. We dive into some really fascinating discussions around coffee, its the coffee shop's genesis, and its role in society. And this is really going to be educational and helpful for you moving forward as a coffee shop entrepreneur. So really looking forward to sharing that with you. Now, if you haven't yet subscribed to Keys to the Shop, of course, I would encourage you to subscribe, and that way you'll always be updated. Also, share these episodes when you have the opportunity. Share them with a friend and spread the ideas around. It'd be lovely. And if you have the opportunity to rate or review Keys to the Shop on iTunes, I would love that as well, to hear how the show has helped you in your business or your career. It's always really encouraging to hear stories of how the content has helped shape lives for the better. Now, this episode is brought to you by Prima Coffee. Prima Coffee is, in my opinion, one of the best specialty coffee equipment suppliers in the world. And one of the reasons why is because they do such an amazing job curating the best equipment from all over the world and then working with their clients to make sure they're fitted with the exact right equipment for their situations. So if you're in the market for commercial equipment, be it espresso machines, grinders, or brewers, or under-counter refrigeration, sinks, like whatever you need that's commercial equipment, Prima Coffee has it. So whether you're opening a coffee bar for the first time, looking to upgrade your equipment in your existing business, or looking to expand and need to outfit the new store, Prima Coffee is the place to go. Right now, they're running a special for Keys to the Shop listeners. If you go to the website, prima-coffee.com/keys, and enter the promo code HOLIDAY5, you'll receive 5% off your order. Some restrictions apply. Again, that's prima-coffee.com/keys, and the code is HOLIDAY5. That's holiday with a number 5 after it. If you're looking for somebody who you can trust to get you exactly what you need for your situation, then look no further than prima-coffee.com/keys. This episode is also brought to you by Pacific Foods and the Barista Series. The Barista Series is a line of plant-based performance beverages that are designed specifically for the high standards of the professional barista. And it's not just designed for them, it's actually designed with an incredible amount of input from some of the world's best baristas to make sure that this stuff is bench tested to perform on the bar. That's why they call it a performance beverage. So it takes the heat from steaming, produces amazing silky texture, and the flavor balance of the beverage is focused on coffee and not overwhelmed by the type of milk you use. So whether you choose to use oats, soy, almond, rice, coconut, you will know that you're going to get a great end product and your customers are going to be really happy. So I encourage you to get this in your store, try it out for yourself, give your customers a taste, give your baristas a taste. I think you're really going to be impressed with what you find. So go to the website, pacificfoods.com. You can follow the link in the show notes here for this episode. That's pacificfoods.com, and see what the Barista Series can do to help elevate the plant-based options in your cafe. Okay, so today we are going to be diving into some coffee history, and specifically we're going to be focusing in on some areas of cafe history that are going to really help us with how we perceive our role as retailers in the coffee value stream. We're at the end, all the way upstream is the farm, and then we are the last place where coffee gets to shine. And what we do with that product matters so much, and having a sense of history behind us is so incredibly important. And Professor Jonathan Morris is my guest today. He is a coffee historian who has written a great book called Coffee, A Global History. Professor Morris is a research professor in history at the University of Hertfordshire, specializing in the history of coffee. His latest book, Coffee, A Global History, explains how coffee became popular the world over and why tastes in coffee differ all over the world. He was the European editor of Coffee, A Comprehensive Guide to the Bean, the Beverage, and the Industry in 2013, and directed the Cappuccino Conquests research project, which traced the history of Italian-style coffee from the origins of espresso to the global coffee shop chains of today. Passionate about the story of coffee, Professor Morris is a frequent speaker at academic, industry, and consumer events, including the London Coffee Festival, Host Milan, Swiss Coffee Day, and the SCA Coffee Expo. He is a judge for the Best Products and Show Awards at the Specialty Coffee Association annual World of Coffee event. Professor Morris is also an associate professor of the MUMAC Academy. He has worked with a wide range of coffee industry clients, including Allegra Strategies, the Specialty Coffee Association, Lavazza, World Coffee Events, Nuova Simonelli, to name a few. He has written for numerous trade publications and has appeared in coffee documentaries shown in Britain on BBC One and More 4, France, Italy, and US, and has made numerous radio appearances and is featured regularly on our friends over at the Coffee Podcast. Shout out to the Coffee Podcast. And he is here today on Keys to the Shop to talk about the shop. And so we couldn't ask for a better person to talk to and a better authority on the subject. And like I said in the beginning, this conversation is going to be focusing in on the coffee shop and the history of its formation into the form we know it as now. Like, how did this get started? You know, we're going to be discussing the Italian coffee house, the French cafe, the early Middle Eastern coffee shops. We'll also be talking about the social implications of the coffee shop and its role in a society, how we have, as coffee retailers, impacted society, and where are we right now in specialty coffee? What are the peculiar challenges that we have on our hands as retailers, and what can we learn from history that will help us move forward with more wisdom than if we had not paid attention to the history of coffee? So at the end of this conversation, I hope that you feel wiser. I know I certainly did. And as Professor Morris said to me after our conversation, we could have gone on for hours afterwards. There's so much here. You have to read this book. And also, I would encourage you to do research on your own as well. But this conversation is a great place to start. So without further ado, here now is my conversation about cafe history with Professor Jonathan Morris. Well, Professor Morris, thank you so much for joining me on Keys to the Shop. I'm excited to get the chance to talk to you.
Thanks very much for having me.
This book has been very well received and has been really making the rounds, and as have you. Congratulations on the success of the book. How have things been going?
Things have been going really well, actually. I'm really pleased with the way that the book came out, and it sort of gathered momentum. So suddenly, I've got been going on the radio, which has been fantastic, sort of having the chance to engage with the general public that way. And at the same time, talking with people in the coffee community through podcasts like this one, through appearances at the festivals. I was just over at the Milan Coffee Festival, which was quite a hoot because I can speak Italian, but it's kind of fun to try and improvise in Italian for 25 minutes on a book. So it's been a good time, definitely.
So you're a historian by trade, and you have made your way into coffee with this book. And I'm just curious about the path you took to get to this point, to make an investigation of coffee as a subject. How did you arrive at this point? What started it all for you?
Yeah, it is an interesting story. So, I mean, I'm a pure Brit, as it were, but I'd always wanted to study abroad. So I went to Italy to study, and from there I decided to do a PhD in Italian history. And the first half of my career, if you like, was spent sort of working in the archives in Italy, working my way through the profession. And I was focused very much on the history of Italian retailing, the history of Italian shopkeeping. And then in really sort of from the 90s, I started noticing that the drinks that I could only drink in Italy previously, the coffees that I only drank in Italy, had started appearing in the UK with the appearance of the first coffee shops. And then in the years sort of just after the 2000s, I actually started marrying these things up. I got a grant to do a project which was called Cappuccino Conquests, which was really about the spread of espresso, if you like, around the world. So it was focused on Italian coffee, what I called Italian style coffee, and the way that had been taken and the sort of success of that in spreading out and becoming a kind of a global icon of Italy, really. So that was my way into it. And I've worked on that for a few years, and I'm still, that's still my big thing is Italian style coffee. But I've been able to broaden that into the coffee industry in general and to coffee history in general. And so the current book is almost like the primer of Coffee 101 history, because it's trying to get everything in there and everywhere in there and try and bring all that together. So I've, feel I've gradually managed to expand what I can do about coffee, but at the same time, the more you expand, the more you learn about coffee, the more you realize how little you know about it. And I think for all of us in the industry, the more we go into it, the more we realize how much more there is to do.
Oh, absolutely. As somebody 20 years into a career in coffee, it's just the same exact thing. And what a time to get into coffee and studying it when there's all these different modes of coffee, the first, second, third wave, and you go into that in the book extensively and in a lot of other areas as well. And it seems so appropriate that you started with the Italian retail culture because so much of what we've experienced in coffee has been due to the proliferation of places that were inspired by that particular culture, or at least that's my perception of it. I imagine there's a lot of that at play from what you've seen over the years.
Yeah, absolutely. So, I mean, in a sense, my kind of way of learning about it, although I hadn't realized it at the time, was when, as I said, when I first went to Italy, to be honest, the way I learned Italian was in coffee bars. Because, I would take a couple of times, I became quite Italian, go into the coffee bar several times a day, take a coffee. That's where I kind of learned the language, and from observing what was going on, got a better sense of the very specific sort of neighborhood local culture that encircles that, if you like. And that was totally different to Britain, where I'd come from. Different because of what we drank. I mean, I was until that point a tea drinker. And frankly, the reason I started drinking coffee in Italy is because the tea was so bad in Italy. Sorry, Italians, but it really was. And it kind of, started me doing that. And when I then went back to the UK, first of all, I was quite conscious of the fact that we really didn't have those kind of places. We didn't have that kind of sort of meeting place, social place, place where you could just take a little time out. And it wasn't until, to be honest, that wave of really the first, what I would call the coffee shop chains, which had obviously taken Italian coffee, done something with it, repackaged it into a formula that worked for the US and worked in that Anglophone market. And that really kind of opened my eyes to that. And I was just thinking, one day I want to work on that. So it is very much the case that those Italian style coffees are at the heart of what we do today. And a lot of that explains quite a lot of the success of the coffee shop format today, because those coffees, as I see it, could be presented as artisanal, because you could see as a customer something in those coffees that you couldn't basically do at home. People didn't have espresso cappuccino machines. And most people lack the kind of milk preparation skills. So the value added, if you like, of the coffee was quite clear. And really that goes back, certainly in the UK case, right down to first principles. Most people probably using a UK cafe or whatever prior to the advent of those chains would not have really experienced coffee ground on site. So one of the great obvious things now about an espresso bar is, of course, we're grinding the coffee just before we tamp it and put it into the machine, so we get a very fresh experience. That's pretty new for many people at the time. Prior to that, we would be talking about coffee coming out of the can in the US, coming out quite possibly of the instant coffee jar in the UK, but being used actually in commercial settings. So a very kind of low-grade coffee. So the introduction of Italian coffee, really Italian-style coffee, and we can talk about what Italian style means, but the introduction of that changed the nature of the way that the coffee was perceived, and it enabled the coffee to be presented as something different. And I think that comes to the heart of, if you like, what the coffee shop today is able to offer, and also why people will use a coffee shop rather than just say, oh, it's a cup of coffee, I can make it at home.
There's a lot of social interest in that. The whole third place concept of, it is seemingly obvious to people, maybe when it was just an Italian thing, that's what they did, but they might not have called it that. It was just an accepted part of life. But the commodification of the idea of a third place has spread that. And I feel like there's so much that people do with coffee shops, like you said, and they do it because of this need they have socially to have that place outside of work and home, and having that novel experience of special coffee being prepared for them, right down to the drinks that people like to make fun of today. They have a utility, they have a purpose to create a draw for people to exit their homes and their businesses and partake in public life a little bit.
Absolutely. And it's interesting that we do that in cultures in different ways. So if we think about the classic Italian coffee bar, actually the classic Italian coffee bar, when you look a bit harder, is very different from what we have in terms of what we experience in the coffee shop in the UK and US. And obviously part of that is about the drinks, and we can come back to that. But a lot of it is also about the way that we socialize. So the Italian sort of coffee experience obviously is, it's mostly based on espresso. It's very quick. You go in, you drink your coffee, you probably walk there with your friend, you walk out with your friend, maybe you smoke a cigarette on the way. It's not a huge, long social thing. There is an opportunity to maybe do that on a Sunday when it's a hang-around day when you might sit down. There's the chance of maybe you pick out the paper for a few minutes, but it's a pretty quick experience. So that's very different from the way that works in the coffee shop, the kind of what I would call the international coffee shop format, which is very much that notion of the time spent in the shop being the thing that marks that apart. So what we're providing is a specialty coffee that also, in a sense, is kind of accompanied by the ability to enjoy the coffee shop and all its facilities for a period of time. And we use that as a place to go meet people, which means that it also means we don't have to meet them in our house, or we don't have to invest huge amounts of time with them, but we can kind of sit down, do our 20, 30 minutes conversation, etc. And that feeds back to the point I would make about the beverages being different, but actually adapted, because of course, we take a little bit of time to warm up as to how we want to talk. So we want a beverage that's a bit bigger. So if we sit down and by the time it's cooled down and then we have to drink it all, we've got our 20 minutes. So it's not embarrassing that we sat there for 20 minutes and had a talk. Do you see what I mean? Whereas if we had a tiny little espresso cup, that makes it it kind of doesn't quite fit for the average customer, that function of give me an excuse to sit down and have a chat.
That's a great point. And we have people in cafes generally, I see it, hours and hours just at the same table with their drinks. Even if they're not drinking them, the cups they're large enough they can nurse it for that long. It's a longer social engagement. And there's a lot more work being done in the coffee bars. And
Yeah.
This all kind of draws me to this question about the role of coffee bars, and this is obviously not a one answer question because coffee bars look a lot different and function a lot different. But generally speaking, I think from your study of it, especially, what is the role that coffee shops play in the value stream of coffee and in society? Is it really that third place and different modes of that third place depending on your culture?
I think it's different modes of that, but there's one particularly important function, it seems to me, that works for coffee shops. And that is it's not so much the democracy, it's the egalitarian nature of it. Yeah, it's that so if we go right back to the very first coffee shops, to the Ottoman sort of coffee houses, and then the first coffee houses in Europe, the key thing about them was that in theory, anyone could go in and they would be treated as an equal. And some of that equality is about things that we might not even think about today. So it's, you get served in the order that you arrive, you go sit at any table that you want, or in fact, usually at that time, you sit on some big bench and you're put next to the previous person who came in, and you start your conversation. So what that means is if we're not actually assessing rank, we're not sort of separating out, is this a gentleman? Is this an ordinary man, etc.? It means that we can actually inhabit the same space and be treated equally. Now that's a very big draw, and clearly for a lot of the time that's a very political statement too. So it's no accident that the first explosion of the coffee house in Britain, in London in the 1650s, coincides first of all with that period when, in fact, it's that short period when between when we've executed a king and when we appoint another one. So the fact that in the 1650s we had very briefly the Commonwealth. The notion that people were equal, particularly in London, where that coffee phenomenon starts, is actually very important because the coffee shop embodies that, and the way that we're treated in there embodies that. And again, if you spiel that right forward to today, you think about the fact we all queue up to place our order, and our order is placed in the order that we arrive. That's very important. That does, that you're treating everyone the same, and that's actually a big part, I think, of our feeling comfortable with the experience.
That's really fascinating. We are in an era where we are comparing our queuing to fast food a lot in the industry. Yeah. We want to try to figure out different ways to show hospitality, and I think the mentality is, and certainly I've had this idea that, queuing up like that is just so impersonal. But what I hear you saying is that at a time it was revolutionary, and it was the progressive way of service at its genesis.
Yeah, absolutely. And if I could draw a distinction, if you think about the difference between a coffee shop, a coffee house, and a cafe, particularly a grand cafe, it's that one of those big differences is the difference between, as it were, that egalitarian mode of service, the coffee bar, over the counter, quick service, the queuing in the coffee shop, compared with the, being seated, being waited upon, but also then seeing those multiple sort of little, sort of differences in treatment that one might receive. Which table am I given? Does the waiter come to me first, or does they come over to somebody else, etc.? And the time that can take, as opposed to the service that we get through the coffee shop. So actually, I think that egalitarian thing matters quite a lot.
Do you feel and this is maybe a little on the side, but do you feel as though because there's not as much obvious classism in society today, or in a lot of different, I would say like in the US, for example, and maybe so also in London, UK, that importance has sort of worn off in that we can have table service without people worrying about whether or not they've been given the prime spot, or is it still just there on different pretext?
Well, I think that still has an implication to it. So I would much rather go to the counter, order my coffee, take the seat that I want, either when I receive my coffee, or if you told me, okay, we'll bring it to you at the table. That service is fine. But actually, if I have to sit there and wait for a waiter to decide to serve me first or somebody else first, or, they're not prompt, that starts to grate. So actually, I do think that I don't think, I think we do now still keep that differentiation in our head between the notion of what happens when we go in and someone decides where we are seated and when and how we are treated, as opposed to that kind of egalitarian thing of effectively being able to make our choices and be treated equally as we go through the process.
So I'm interested in the modes of coffee bars throughout history. We often, like I said in the beginning, first, second, third wave, but before all those, there's a whole ocean, as it were, of
exactly.
other modes. And so I wonder if you could elaborate on what you've seen throughout history, the coffee shop, how it's taken form.
Sure. So that's one of the things that I do find as a historian a little irritating is when we do the classic three waves thing. Wave one is about 500 years of history, and the other two are, 30 years and 5 years or something like that. So where, it doesn't really help us. What I've done in the book and how I tend to think about it is to divide this much more into what I would call the 5 eras of coffee history. So you have that era, from the first point that we know that people were drinking coffee, which is really that period of the spread of coffee really within the Islamic Middle Eastern world. So a coffee which does become a coffee house, very much. The service goes into coffee houses, but is very much shaped initially around, it's shaped by religion, but it's also shaped by relationship to two things, to religion and to alcohol. And those things actually echo throughout the whole of the history of coffee, as we'll see. But in essence, the coffee house is the first secular place where a good Muslim can interact socially outside, therefore, of the mosque, can meet people, can sit, can talk, can do all of those kinds of things without either breaking their religion or taking alcohol. So it's a really critical first stage. And actually, a lot of what happens in the Ottoman coffee houses and in those early coffee houses is very much still part of the way that we think of it today. So there is that, served as equals. There is that thing that you could go in as a kind of a foot soldier, or you could go in as a general and you'd be treated the same. There is the same sort of sets of entertainments around the coffee, creating the ambience. So the storyteller, for example, is a classic feature, yes, of those early coffee houses. So we start with that. We then have this sort of second wave, which I would call the kind of the coffee as a colonial good, in which we see the first coffee houses come established in Europe. We see particularly the first coffee houses actually start, as we said, in London, in the UK, very rapidly spread across the rest of Europe as well. The divergence that we then see is between the original coffee houses, very much similar to those Ottoman ones, similar sort of democratic service, places in which particularly people gather for, if you like, like-minded people. And so sometimes that's work. So the coffee house that functions as as the early stock exchange, as it were, or very famously the shipping brokers, the coffee house established by Lloyd that becomes Lloyd's, that today is the great shipping agency, where in effect people are meeting, again, the big attraction being that they're not in the tavern and are effectively trading. They're meeting together as like-minded people. They might be trading insurance contracts. They might be trading stocks. Coffee House Jonathan's is really often seen as the precursor of the stock market. They might be people who have a common interest in, say, science, as it was understood then. The Royal Society, the very prestigious scientific body in the UK, begins effectively by meeting in a coffee house. So, and we have on top of that, a lot of people go to the coffee house because they want to see maybe a particular display of curios, or they want to attend a particular set of events. So Chaucer used to go to a coffee house, not Chaucer, I mean Pepys, of course, used to go to the coffee house as a way of listening to people debating particular issues, political issues, and making his political contacts. So this sort of function of the coffee house in that second era is almost one that I would say translates to what we see a little bit today, which is coffee houses have that democratic format, as we said, that egalitarian format, but they also tend ultimately to attract a like-minded clientele. So they create their own clientele, often with some kind of function going on within them. But I would say that then this is where you get to then the really interesting thing about alcohol. Because whereas the UK coffee house and its appeal is very much as a non-alcoholic venue, and that would be revived later. In France and on the continent, particularly in the sort of the kind of the France and greater French Mediterranean areas, so Italy it would be another example, there something particular happens, and it's about guilds. The guild in France that is given the right ultimately to sell coffee, or rather more accurately to serve coffee, is the Distillers Guild. And so you'll often read that it's quite often known by the nice name of limonadières, so lemonaders. But in fact, what they mostly do is distill spirits. But they are given the right then to serve decoctions of spirits, or decoctions per se rather, to people at table. And that could be coffee, it could be lemonade, but it could equally be gin, it could be those kind of alcohols, alcoholic spirits in particular. And from that comes that great divergence, because then these people have an integrated trade where from the beginning they're serving side by side alcohol, coffee. They're creating that very particular institution which becomes the kind of, the French cafe, where, you go during the day for your coffee, you go in the evening to drink, you get your food, you probably go to smoke as well. And the smoking is another thing that's quite interesting. It also comes into that original Ottoman style, Turkish style coffee house. So that creates quite a big division between what, for want of a better word, in what becomes the Anglo-American world, is one of the major attractions of the coffee house as a non-alcoholic environment. And again, I think that's still very important in what happens in the past, sort of, in the times of the specialty revolution, the coffee shop, the great growth of the coffee shop, the fact that they are, for the vast majority, are non-alcoholic venues is very important in how we now attract customers. But then on the continent, you're having this completely different thing where the two become combined and can live side by side, creating that kind of cafe. And what that separation that we see in the UK between coffee house and licensed house doesn't occur.
So you have these two factions essentially, and within them there are, when people are going to a coffee bar and it's egalitarian, as you say, it's a democratic place where people will be with like-minded people. So within it, there's groups of people there for their own purposes, or cliques or groups of, like-minded people. How did that differentiation impact the way that we see coffee bars today? Because I see right now, especially as craft breweries and distilleries are on the rise, along with specialty coffee, there's the combination of both of them. A lot of the best coffee bars out there right now have their liquor licenses, or at least they serve beer along with coffee. So it's almost like you're seeing that again now.
Yeah, and I think it's a very interesting moment with that, in the sense that you can see the fit, specialty coffee, craft brewing. Yeah, I absolutely get that. The thing is, what if you think about the success of the coffee shops in the last 20, 30 years, a lot of their success has been attracting in or making people feel again equal who are not part of the usual bar, as in alcohol bar trade. On the easiest level, you might say that might apply to women. Certainly, there's a sense that a coffee shop is a much less threatening atmosphere, or potentially threatening atmosphere, than an alcohol bar can be. There's the attraction for a large number of people who just don't drink, may not do that for cultural, social reasons, may not do that for personal reasons. For those who feel some kind of form of, a difference, let's say, and find the coffee shop a much more accepting environment of diversity in those respects. Now, what will be interesting, therefore, I think, with coffee shops that have now acquired those alcohol licenses, is how successfully they can keep that clientele, or at least not alienate that clientele from the premises as they become, as those things overlap. Now that, it's a cultural thing. And as I say, I think that would be perceived as far less problematic in some of those sort of French Italian coffee bars, which simply sort of, are cafes, as it were. But I do think it was still, and I'd speak, as a kind of participant observer in this one, it was still a big factor in the rise of the coffee shop again, or the rebirth of the coffee shop in Britain. We have to remember that those original coffee houses that I talked about, there was this fad for coffee houses in the late 17th, 18th century. And then the coffee house in the UK really disappears again. And it disappears, to be honest, because they started coming back into pubs. And as that happens, that pub culture took over, absorbs the coffee house culture, and the coffee house as an institution rather disappears. So there is a danger from going down that line, the one that we've seen in the UK. And again, that I think was a significant part of the appeal of the early coffee shops, the coffee shops in the 90s, 2000s, was precisely this non-alcoholic, non-pub culture that's enabled people to frequent them. So there is a sense that, as we always play with those formats, but I've also noticed that certainly when we look at the UK, and my impression, and I'd be interested to learn more from you about this, to some extent the US, that certainly at the level of the big chains and at the level of many of our sort of local coffee shops, they have either continued to avoid alcohol or have tried it and actually not found that much success. So in the UK, I would say most coffee shops, their business is done by about 6 o'clock in the evening. That's the standard close time. And then there will be a community of people who will go separately to an alcohol venue. I think that, well, I would be interested to learn from you more about how you see that playing out in the States. But it is true that we do have places that shift into the craft brewery and so forth. But I don't think that has proved a hugely successful or has gained a huge lot of traction in the UK. And I suspect that is because of those differentials.
The coffee bar, by virtue of caffeine, I suppose, also as a correlating factor would be the intellectual place. And when you're imbibing in alcohol, it's hard to have an intellectual conversation a little bit on into the visit. So it seems like it almost separates itself by the product, like whatever the social end product would be is what people have in mind. They're going to go to the bar for one reason and go to a coffee bar for a separate reason. And so I see the same thing with the way people incorporate alcohol in coffee bars now. It's very sparingly. It's not like a raucous environment at night, and maybe not even a lot of nighttime visitors, because it's primarily a coffee bar. And so it automatically creates this perception of, well, this is not the place to forget my troubles because it's well lit and it's going to have other people there that are not there for the same reason. So the unity of like-minded people is almost like there's a schism there.
Yeah, I think that's a really interesting point, because in effect, it's also about what, if we're going, obviously a lot of people go to the coffee shop to be on their own, or to be on their own in the midst of other people, as it were. And that's one sort of set of customers. And then we have those other sets of customers who are socializing or meeting in different ways. Yeah. So you would think about moving your work meeting out of your workplace maybe and meeting up in the coffee shop to do your kind of inspirational groupthink. It's unlikely you would think about that, taking that to an alcohol venue. On the other hand, you would probably think after work, that's the place we want to go, relax, drink our beers or whatever. So I think there is quite a significant set of differentiations there. You can see why there's a desire to, as it were, make the space work for you for as much of the day portion as you can. And I get that. But I do think that there are some lessons or some thinking to be done about how we carry over that ambience into different portions of the day, and how we effectively let the clientele that is attracted to the coffee shop not become alienated by that later day part.
It also seems that desire people have for the coffee shop is, again, that innate desire for that social third place, and for different reasons, both the bar and the coffee shop provide the same thing, as do barbershops and pool halls and things like that. However, when we're going to these places now, and I would love to hear your opinion on this, and what I sense is that when we're saturated as a market with all these coffee bars who seem to be taking their cues from the classic coffee bar, they're more niched down. So you have coffee bars that are almost designed for a specific group of people. And, we have encouraging people to, describe their avatar and their perfect customer and their business plans. And it's not satisfactory to a banker to say, well, everybody, that's why I want to serve. You have to be more specific, and in being more specific with your clients that you're hoping to attract, it's almost as if you're inadvertently alienating that thing that makes it a democratic institution. Do you see any kind of danger or starting point where we're starting to sort of niche ourselves back into an exclusionary institution rather than a democratic one?
I think that there are definitely some difficulties with that. So one of in a sense, I suppose the first thing to say is that the way that a traditional Italian coffee bar works is it's a neighborhood joint. Yeah, it's what it does is serve a particular neighborhood in a way that a lot of those small town coffee shop, small one town, one coffee shop per town, things was on the same principle. Once you go into a position where you've got a large number of places offering coffee service, then you clearly, that's when imagining your customer avatar is important, yeah, or knowing what your demographic is going to be. In terms of what you might call over niching, which is what I kind of hear you talking about, I think there's an interesting question there, which is about the nature, particularly of specialty and how we convey that. Kind of one of the drives of specialty has always been to increase the perceived value and understanding and education around the product. And I think that has been effective, but it's also can create the possibilities to be quite exclusionary. And unfortunately, that also plays into a mindset of sort of, rejecting elements of coffee culture as being too snobbish or too exclusionary or whatever. So I'll give you a rather weird demonstration of this, which is at the moment, you may or may not be aware that we have an election in the Labour Party, so that's our sort of our more left-wing party, for a new leader. And one of the things that has been happening has been an attempt among the various candidates and their backers to position themselves as more and more, that they have the right sort of solid working class background. And one of the ways that they do that is to signal by saying, well, I think one of our problems was we wrote too much policy in coffee shops, or, well, I'm drinking my cappuccino right now, but of course I'd much rather be drinking my, insert name of old style instant soluble coffee or whatever, I really don't care, blah, blah, blah. Now, I find that very pretentious and also very, I mean, it's kind of insulting to everybody, quite frankly, because there's certainly no lack of people who are drinking good coffee from those groups. But it's indicative, I think, of a problem that specialty faces, which is getting to the point that people react against it for being exclusionary by demanding too much knowledge or cultural capital from consumers before going in. And that, is something I think that is quite a difficult number to face, because there's something delightful for those of us who've, lived this, and we're now we go in and we want to generate, what kind of pour over we want, and we want to be able to know that we can tell, not just that you have some coffee for us, but that we can discuss with you what kind of our preferences is. Do you have some natural? Do you have some geisha or whatever? But it does create a difficulty of becoming, of how you handle that while still making the place egalitarian. So I do think that is a problem. I mean, I should say I go to London a lot, but I actually live in a town just outside London, a commuter town. So I came here in the late 90s, and the only place that I could get an espresso-based beverage easily was in fact the supermarket coffee shop, believe it or not. I've lost count now of the number of coffee shops that we have with an espresso machine in. We've been through the appearance of the very first coffee shops, which were set up by independents, who were full of enthusiasm, who loved making cappuccinos, who saw it as a whole new thing, and we did too. And We've, moved through the chain section where we now have several chains. We have chains inside other stores. We now have our first specialty style stores, all within a town of maybe 20,000 at most inhabitants. The way that I see those stores having become developed, with the exception of the exception really of one of the specialty stores, is that they've all become increasingly about what's the environment they've created, who are the people who will go there. It's become less and less about beverages, except in that one or two specialty places, and more about ambience. Is this the place for young mothers? So we have one coffee shop, very successful, attached to a kind of, not quite a kindergarten, but more a sort of a place which is kind of a place for parents to take their kids. We have some that are clearly targeting a more mature demographic, some that are trying to look very sort of, building their ambience about the refurbishment, some that trade quite a lot on their status as chains and therefore claiming to, be able to do this more efficiently, and just one or two that are actually putting more and more accents on coffee. But the problem with this ever increasing number of coffee shops is that actually, as customers, it's not clear anymore what does a new shop give us that we don't already have. And in a way, I think that's again, that's the other challenge for where we go with specialty, because we're giving more and more special experience, and that does make us different. But again, we're having to educate the consumer each length of that time. And that challenges that initial democratic egalitarianism, because it means more that if somebody walks into your shop, you're again into, maybe this is a good thing, you're perhaps almost back to this pioneering stage where you've got to explain to them why what you're doing is different, and why just having the cappuccino or the latte in all those other stores, it's fine, but it's not now where we are. There's something more about your coffee. And that's, again, another difficulty which comes in, which is, of course, the price. So if we go through our sort of sets of comparisons, so the Italian coffee bar is governed by a regime that in effect ends up meaning that you charge a very low price for coffee. So as a historian, I can tell you how that evolved, and it evolved in a very weird way, because just before the First World War, some legislation was introduced to try and effectively to make sure that when war broke out, certain items, their price was kept low to counter inflation and to make them accessible to the public. And one of those was a cup of coffee a cup of coffee with no service is how it's defined. And for that reason, that cup, that's why we always see the use of the counter in Italy. And some of your, listeners may have encountered this odd thing of that if you sit down, suddenly your coffee becomes double in price, because at that point you've got some service.
Yes.
But the point I'm trying to say here is that price means that the margins are very low. That's why chains have not really appeared in Italy. We only just had the entry of Starbucks. But it's also been, so it's been in one sense a very democratizing thing, in the other sense a very limiting thing. The coffee shop format that's taken over in the last sort of 30 years through the Anglo-American world, through now basically the world, has obviously been premised on coffee, repositioning coffee from, if you like, the equivalent position to the Italian one, which would be maybe like the US diner one, where again, the unlimited cup of coffee, effectively is a cup of coffee priced so low that you're bound to get a pretty poor coffee, to one where we see the coffee as having, a value, as we said, an artisanal value, which has enabled us to put the price somewhat higher, which creates a bigger margin, which means that we can do all the rest of the nice refurb, etc., around it, and kind of give you that wrapped into the price of your coffee. But to go any further, of course, we have to go up again. And that again then becomes a question of how do you explain that? Well, I haven't actually given you a nicer environment. What I've given you is a better coffee. And that's a big sell right now, I think, again. That's still a sell that we kind of, we can do within our high-end specialty community. But to break that out to the next level of customers, to enable that to still be egalitarian, yet at the same time say, well, actually, yeah, you're right. You can go to the chain and get your cappuccino for £2, £2. But, if you come here, you're going to pay more for a cappuccino, but actually you're going to pay a lot more when I make you a pour over.
So, yeah, very true.
And why that matters and yet can still be democratic. That's quite a big stretch at the moment.
It is. And you see companies, I'll use Trade, for example, as a subscription coffee service. And they do a very good job of promoting a line of coffees from craft roasters who they cater to make it accessible to people who they don't want people to have to go through all of those different levels of understanding and education and, this knife goes here, that fork goes there, basically in coffee. And we just talked with Peter Giuliano on the show about this trend of accessible coffee options where you have the 80 to sub 90 point coffees basically, and more developed coffees as a reaction to an industry reaction to the problem that I think you're describing, which is that what we're offering people seems to them to be exclusionary, somewhat based on taste and also on education. So on two fronts, it seems like we have one, don't worry about being educated, we won't sneer at you. Two, don't worry about having to taste hot grapefruit juice every time you drink a coffee, and it will be the nutty, the chocolatey that you like, which seems like it was a successful bid of coffee makers when it was the quote unquote first wave of chock full of nuts and Maxwell House. That seemed like the kind of democratic movement of coffee for people that we would almost want to take advantage of in our specialty era right now.
Yeah, I think that the thing there is that it's it's who are you placing your trust in. So the chock full of nuts, etc. All of that, I would say, was really, two things are important there. One is that you put your trust in the blend. So you put your trust in the roaster. It's the roaster who makes those decisions for you, and you're putting your trust in the brand. And within that, the roaster, you're trusting to produce the blend, because as we know, those blends, actually the components of those blends changed quite a lot. But actually the skill of the blend is to be able to substitute different coffees, but to produce the same overall sensory taste. Now, I noticed that specialty blending is becoming, again, something that we're now doing again, having had years of single origin is what it's all about. And I think that is quite an interesting route that we'll be able to say again, okay, we've got this good coffee. We've created the blend. So, you need to know, maybe, do you like it? Yeah. Do you like it dark roast? Do you like it light roast? Do you like nutty? Do you like fruity? That's it. From that, we can give you something really good. And it will still have to be specialty, something that you can taste in the cup is superior. It's superior product without you having to do all the work, or without you, the consumer, having to do all the work, or without you, the consumer, feeling that you just can't get there. So I'm seeing that as maybe also like the sort of the way that wine is quite nicely gradated between, okay, there is the absolute, entry-level wine, the, dare I say, Gallo or whatever. So it's, we know where you are, but then there is actually a level which most consumers are at, which is, between there and the sort of, Robert Parker 95 point or whatever, where that's what we'll buy and drink for a nice weekend or so forth. So it's a way of trying to render that accessible. Again, obviously, I know the UK parallel better. So one of the things that was critical in the UK for wine was actually a very simple thing, where instead of selling wine by regional denomination, so that people say, here's your Beaujolais, here's your Lorraine or whatever, it was sold by grape type. Here are all the Chardonnays, here are all the Pinot Noirs, here are all the Shirazes. That was actually a really key moment for the UK consumer in having a path that took them out from very basic wine to be able to make that next step up. So I think that is probably the thing we're looking at. And we do have some roasters who are trying to do that in the UK, so who are trying to find that midpoint. And it sounds like Peter was talking about something of the same, if from what I'm understanding. I'm going to have to go listen to Peter's podcast now. And yeah, I do think that there is something there about, what is the way that we maintain the relevance to the consumer of specialty, and therefore provide them with a path that walks them into specialty without it being uncomfortable or off-putting or overwhelming, which I think is actually the biggest problem.
The way you describe when people first started queuing up to get coffee, all the way back to the beginning, where the revolution of having that egalitarian style of service, where now it's a breath of fresh air. I don't have to worry. I'll be taken care of. I'll get the same service, and there's not a bunch of curtsies that I need to do. Now it seems that we've, in order to emphasize the specialty nature of it, created these barriers to entry that we're trying to dismantle, albeit slowly, but it does seem like a promising trend. And I suppose this has all been incredibly fascinating, and I'm sure that we could, there's so much more to talk about. But I want to ask sort of a final question here, which is, as we are sort of writing our next era right now, if you want to call that progressive or third wave or whatever it becomes known as, in the next history book about coffee, what would you say would be the best practice for us currently, based on what's been most successful for coffee houses in the past? What are the things that we maybe should repeat or should be practicing in your view, and maybe some things that we shouldn't?
Wow, that's a big question to ask. So I think we can't let go of that notion of accessibility. So the egalitarianism that we've talked about. And I think that, as we said, that's been a long time feature of coffee service, really, that's been successful. I think that the other thing there is, and this, I hope this doesn't contradict what I was just saying, don't underestimate our consumers either. I think that that's one of the things that led to, if you like, the situation that created the specialty backlash, was that consumers were in the reverse to what we're talking about. We're talking about being careful to bring them with us, but actually there was also quite a sense of, well, we can just downgrade all the time to the consumer. Oh. And that's also a problem, yeah? So the big achievement of the specialty era is to have repositioned coffee as something with greater than minimal value. We can again think of it as being something more of not just a day-to-day routine, but something as a good that has some value beyond that. That I think is something that we will need to keep. And that, again, actually, to go with that wine parallel, is something that I think was achieved with wine, that we are achieving with coffee. To maneuver it away from, if you like, this is our greatest achievement is to keep the price low, to our greatest achievement is to deliver you reasonable coffee at a reasonable price. And I think that final thought would be about sociability and inclusivity. So when we think about, I was reading Trish Rothgeb the other day, about her notion of what a fourth wave would be. And it seemed her notion of a fourth wave was that actually it would be much more about the inclusivity and openness to diversity, if you like, of the entire business surroundings operation of the coffee, as well as simply the product. And there is something in there again that I think is important, and that is something that coffee has done. It has provided those spaces and can provide those spaces. And I think that would be a very valuable thing to take forward as our next sort of phase of coffee.
Professor Morris, thank you so much for joining us on the show. This has been really eye-opening, and it really is great to learn from history, the things that have gone before us, so that we have a better view of what lays ahead and what we should do. You've done such a great job with your book and here in this discussion. How can people get in touch with you, buy the book, and maybe even have you come speak about the history of coffee?
Well, people can, in the short, probably the easiest way is people can Google me and Google the book, if I'm allowed to use that as a verb. So the book is available, as they say, from all good booksellers, including all those booksellers that you know on the internet. If you go to the actual publisher of the book, if you go to the site, therefore, so in the UK and Europe, that would be Reaction Books, Rektion, and in the US, it's distributed by University of Chicago Press. If you go there and when you check out the book, put in coffee 20 as your code, then you'll get 20% off the book. So I'd be delighted if listeners would do that and treat themselves to saving some money. If you want to get in contact with me, drop me an email. The email that I use on coffee is called coffeehistoryjm@gmail.com, or just go, possibly the easiest thing of all, go follow me on Twitter. My handle is @coffeehistoryjm. Follow me there, and if you want to follow up with me and set something up, DM me. So I am going to be at the SCA Expo as well, talking at SCA Expo up in Portland. So obviously, because I know a lot of your listeners are in the States, if you're going to go up to Expo, do come, come and have a chat. That would be great.
Excellent. Well, thank you again. And this was just a great discussion. I really appreciate it.
I really enjoyed it. Thank you very much.
Well, I hope that this episode was enlightening to you, and that it has given you some perspective in how we are going to move forward as an industry, and what your role is in your neck of the woods. Whether you are a single coffee shop or you are a chain coffee shop, you have an impact on society, and the decisions that we make with our marketing, with our service, and the coffees that we offer, either a sense of exclusion or a sense of inclusion. And that is what the coffee house has always seemed to be focused on, because that's what it seems people have always wanted from it, which is that equal meeting ground, a place where there's a low barrier of entry, where everyone is treated the same, where there's a diverse group of people, where everyone is included. And if we can do that in our own way, in our shops, then we'll be helping to write a great next chapter for the next coffee history book. So a huge thank you to my guest today, Professor Jonathan Morris, for coming on the show and sharing all of his insights and knowledge on this subject. It certainly has been helpful. Go out and get this book for sure. Links are in the show notes to do that. And if you have the ability to go and hear Professor Morris speak at any coffee event, in particular the Coffee Expo, the SCA Expo coming up in Portland in April, he'll be speaking there. You should definitely take advantage of that opportunity. So thank you once again, Professor Morris. Now, if you want the transcript from this episode, along with bonus resources and the links, etc., sent to your inbox, you can go to keystotheshop.com and fill out the contact page and click the box that says sign me up, and that will sign you up for the email list. Every week we'll send you the transcripts from the main episodes, along with the links from resources mentioned in each of the episodes, and related podcasts as well to that subject. And then you'll also get some bonus resources in the form of links to writings or videos that will help you in your career, things that I find around the internet that will just be good resources for you. Again, go to keystotheshop.com, fill out the contact information, and click the box to sign up, and you'll be all set. Now, if you want to reach out to me directly, you can do so by emailing chris@keystotheshop.com. I always love to hear your feedback and questions, comments, and that's also the email to use if you want to inquire about working with Keys to the Shop Consulting to help you with your business. If you're interested in on-site assessment of your business, training of your employees, or doing a workshop with your managers, or even over-the-phone coaching for yourself, all of those are options, and we can talk about what works best for you. Reach out, chris@keystotheshop.com. And with that, we are at the end of our episode. I thank you so much for joining me and learning a little bit about cafe and coffee history. Such a fascinating conversation. Glad to share that time with you. And as always, I hope that this episode has truly given you keys to the shop.